American Graffiti. This is a George Lucas film that I have not seen, and
Ah,
embarrassingly, I'm a Star Wars kid. I basically started from there and moved forward with very little knowledge of his filmography. I'm gradually filling that in. So this is kind of a thrill. It's a perfect end of summer kind of back to school kind of movie because it takes place in 1963 and it deals with
two,
two. Okay, I thought it was
1962.
Okay, I thought it was 63, but but it deals with three recently graduated high school kids and they're going off to school. And one of them, Kurt, played by they're all baby faces in this movie, but a really young Richard Dreyfuss
Hmm.
is questioning whether or not he goes off to school or whether or not he hangs around the town, like his friend slash idol John, played by Paul Amat. Now, this I had heard about this film for decades, of course. It's very famously one of the films that put Lucas on the map, but I'd never watched it. I didn't know what to expect.
Ah,
Um, this is the first time I've seen it, and we're talking about it. You've seen it a number of times. I understand,
yes.
Pat McDonald, that you have a story about American Graffiti that you'd like to
Well,
share.
I do believe I mentioned this on the podcast before,
Okay.
but in 1973, when this movie came out, I was 13 years old. So I just gone, America had just gone through a huge movie phase. The Godfather, the 1-2 punch of The Godfather and The Exorcist. Two movies I desperately wanted to see because of the hype. And my parents had gone and seen them before. And because of the content in each of the film, there was no way I was going to see either of those films. And the way they bought me off was to take me to American Graffiti. And I remember it so, so well because it was summer. The movie theater was cool. I was with my parents, and the movie is very cool. It's filmed almost all at night, and in that sense, I just remember that feeling of just coolness about the film. Number one was an adult movie that I was seeing for the first time, albeit with my parents, but still, it felt like a different phase of my life, and I can really, again talk about my development in film. It came mostly from television, but this was a push into the realm of the theater, and a new feeling about film that generated itself throughout the 70s. So that's my old man story.
Well, I want to delve into that a little bit because the first thing that springs to mind is this is a 1973 PG rated movie, which means
Right.
it's very different than a PG movie we'd get today. For example, there's sort of adult themes about, the teenagers, will they or won't they go all the way before the guy goes off to college? There is a young high school girl like flat out mooning a guy as she
Yeah.
drives by in the car.
Yeah. That was pretty wild.
Right. So did your folks, was there any sense that you're like, well,
Well, I don't.
this isn't
It
as
was all
good as
such.
bad as The Exorcist, but
Yeah, it was all such harmless fun. And you're right. The PG movies of the day were much different. They showed nudity. I mean, a nudity now gets you an automatic R, I believe. Here we are 50 years later, but we're actually more constricted, as a country than we were back then. Things that were sneaking by. You know what? It was the F word that got you an automatic R in those days. Of course, they don't mention it in this movie. There's cursing, but interestingly enough, I watched it with the titles on because then I could get a more full sense of it. And whenever they cursed, they always substituted a word in the titles, at least on the Amazon download, which I thought was strange. But anyway,
really?
so yeah, there's a sensibility in this film that is truly adult because everybody is in transition. This is what struck me when I watched it. Everybody in the film, the main characters, are in transition. Paul and Matt is the man who's hanging out in the town, but he knows his days are numbered there. And he knows his days as the number one drag racer is numbered as well. And of course, Cindy Williams, who plays Laurie, and Ron Howard, who plays Paul. Paul is going off.
Steve.
Steve, I'm sorry, and he is transitioning to school or deciding to transition to school. Laurie's transitioning to being a senior, one of the most popular girls in the school. She's a year younger. Mackenzie Phillips' character, Carol, she's a transitioning to teenager, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Kurt, of course, but Kurt, Richard Dreyfuss's character, Toad's character, becoming a man. All of them are transitioning. All of them, even Candy, Toad's Candy Clark. What's Toad's? What's her name in the movie?
Debbie.
Debbie. Yeah, even Debbie is kind of transitioning from being a go-around girl to somebody who's going to settle down, perhaps with Toad. So yeah, everybody's in transition in this film, and I think it kind of reflects Lucas's feeling of his last 10 years. It was only 10 years after his graduation. And can you imagine, let's take a year, let's say 2008 to 2018. Now, a lot happened in that period, especially Trump's election, but is there really that much of a difference between those 2 years as far as a social sense? Whereas in 72 to 60 or 62 to 72, America changed completely. And you can say with nostalgia that we're looking back to a simpler, more innocent time. We can't say that about 2018 to 2008.
Well, you can in ways that are, I think because the change happened, it was so all-consuming but so subtle. Social media, you look at
Oh,
Facebook,
that's
that was
true.
2007. I no, but I
That's a
understand.
good argument.
Well, I understand what you're saying though, because, and that's something for the historians to cover, is
Right.
I'm not going to use the word pernicious, but it's the best word I can think of. It's just the way that we lived our lives. People have to go back and think like, oh, Facebook and Twitter, they weren't always around. you know?
Well, yeah, and the influence of them are much more substantial in 18 than they were in 08.
Right.
So yeah, I definitely give you that. But I wanted to ask you, what did you think about nostalgia in general in the film? Since you're looking at this with fresh eyes, you've never seen the film before. The story is very and highly nostalgic. What was your feeling about that sense of nostalgia?
It's weird because I had a feeling of nostalgia for an era that I didn't, I wasn't born in 63. I wasn't even born in 73,
Right.
or 62 rather. But it was, a lot of it was seeing the fresh young faces of all these actors,
Right.
and just thinking about George Lucas. I mean, this was his second feature after THX 1138, another movie I haven't seen.
Yeah, I haven't
Although
seen it either.
I did love the fact that the John character, Paul Lamont, on his 1937 Roadster, the license plate was THX 138. A nice little nod. Lucas was thinking about these referential in jokes before anybody knew who he was. It was almost like he could see into the future. And like, someday kids are going to love this.
And also the theater says Dementia 13, which was one of Coppola's early films, who was a producer of the film. So
Nice.
yeah, there's a lot of nice in jokes in it.
But you look at this and, you could probably tell this better than I could, but my sense is that a lot of the people who are in this film, this is like their breakout. I mean, Ron Howard was a TV star, but
Yeah.
had he done much between Opie and, showing up
No,
as Steve? Because Happy Days was after this, right?
Yeah, it was after interestingly enough, Happy Days was filmed as a pilot as part of Love American Style, which was a glitzy little anthology series in the 60s and 70s. So Love and the Happy Days, 1972. From that, actually, Lucas and Coppola had remembered that he had been in that transitory stage doing that pilot, which he played Richie Cunningham. So everybody thinks that Happy Days was made because of Graffiti, but actually Graffiti came after Happy Days, the pilot. So it's a different
But it went
story.
but it went to series after American Graffiti.
It went to series after American Graffiti because it was picked up due to the popularity of graffiti. So it's all intertwined. And yes, Howard was looking to break out from Opie and got the opportunity to do graffiti through the connections that he had. But yeah, he was arguably, when the film came out, he was the biggest star in it. Think about it, because he was known as Opie to the mass populace, whereas Dreyfuss was known, Harrison Ford's unknown, Suzanne Summers unknown, Cindy Williams unknown. I mean, yeah, Charles Martin Smith. He was 18. Howard was 18. We were the only two teenagers of the principal cast.
I think Dreyfus was something like 24 or 26. Like he was old
Is he that
playing,
old?
yeah.
Okay.
Because
Well, Harrison Ford was 30.
right.
Uh,
But Harrison Ford kind of makes more sense because his character's age is more ambiguous. Because he's the
yes.
guy who's going to be he's gunning for top dragster in town to kind of kick John off his spot, and it's unclear how old John is because you get the sense that he was the guy who, when the other main cast were still in high school, probably for a few
Right.
years, was the cool older kid around town, and now he's just old.
Well, as you recall, he looks back 5 years to his golden age. So I'm figuring he's like 23, 24.
Okay.
And he's finally realizing that, he can't be doing the same thing anymore. That's his transition that he's going through. I mean, he's actually a fairly thoughtful character. He's not thuggish. He's he kind of takes sympathy on for Carol, the character that Mackenzie Phillips plays. And they become their scenes, their chemistry between them is so good in the film. It really surprised me this time when I saw it, because you think about it, thought about her before as just sort of a throwaway, the young kid who gets in the car, but now there's something a little more poignant about their relationship.
Well, yeah, and that you talk about adult themes. So to set it up for anyone who hasn't seen American Graffiti, it is pretty much a one night in the life story of these kids in this town, and they drag the strip in their town and get in all sorts of weird adventures. But one of the stories is Paul Lamat's character, this John guy, driving around in his car trying to pick up girls. This one car pulls over and says, "Hey, I'm not interested, but you might like my friend's sister." And they basically force this, I don't know if she's 12 or 13-year-old
Well,
Mackenzie
she was 12
Phillips.
in reality, but I think they're implying she's like 13, or like she's very young.
Right, but here's the thing.
Probably half the age of Lamat's character.
Two things, and I don't know if this is a maturity of kids in the 70s or what, but Mackenzie Phillips, she looks really young, but she acts wise beyond her years. Not that it's a fake performance, but she is so good in this role that I was blown away. And the other thing is, later on in the film, when she starts developing real feelings for John, and he realizes, I am literally twice your age, and they're going to lock me up if we even have this conversation. He has to put the moves on her, and I'm just thinking about not only the characters but the making of this scene. Like Paul Lamat, who's probably in it, like it's probably a real age difference there. Imagine him having to come on to this 12-year-old girl while breaking her heart, while making it somewhat scary. I'm like, this movie is operating on so many different levels.
Well, also too, Mackenzie Phillips, if you know her history, she was always around those rock and roll people, and I know that there's a few incidences of her being seduced by certain rock and roll characters that her father, John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, hung around.
Oh my God! So she's part of. I didn't put it together that she was part of that family. Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
So she's Phillips' oldest daughter, and there's a lot of things going on even under the surface in reality with that character, and it just again, this time this was the relationship that I focused on. I think as I saw it previous, especially if I'm thinking back to when I first saw it, it was really about who I was familiar with, which was Opie or Ron Howard and his gal. I remember Dreyfus from the first time I saw it. I was like, why are they focusing so much on this guy? I have no idea who he is, But I loved his performance then, and I loved it again seeing it. Kurt is like so strange. He sort of walks in a fog the whole picture,
He does, and I think the connection between Curtis and John is really a strong one, because something you said a minute ago, how John is a lot smarter. He's not just a thug. He's got some substance to him, but he almost seems to have given up on himself. Like he probably could have gone to college. It reminds me of a film I talked about last month with Cole, Stand By Me. The
Ah,
whole
yeah,
idea of River Phoenix's character believing that he was never going to make anything of himself because the town had decided that he wasn't smart enough or good enough to go anywhere. He ends up becoming an attorney. Same thing with John. He could have possibly made something of himself. And with Kurt, almost idolizing John, saying, well, you didn't go to college and you own this town because you've got this fast car. And John's like, yeah, but there's also a guy cruising around looking to, knock me off that spot. And then what do I have if I'm not the cool car guy?
right.
So there's a really great, this movie is full of, is almost like the prototype for the sex comedies we got in the 80s, but with a lot more brains and a heart and like no
Right.
sex. And I
Right.
almost wish this had become as influential as Porky's.
Well, it's interesting. It was. It was in its day. We'll talk about that in a second. But interestingly enough, during the whole film, Kurt is going nowhere. He's the one going nowhere. Where are you going? Nowhere. Mind if I tag along? And also the Great Pretender plays on the soundtrack during his scene. So it's really what happens to you when you decide you're going nowhere? Well, everything happens to you in Kurt's case, and in the course of a night, he has the most adventures. Well, maybe Toad and Debbie have a lot of adventures as well, but
Well, he does have a lot of adventures and encounters. Like there's the one where they're at the school dance and he runs into, I think it was a teacher. I almost got like a vice principal vibe, but I think it was just a
it was a
teacher.
teacher, yeah.
And the teacher is, kind of talking to him like, so you're leaving tomorrow? He's like, I don't know. And he's like, hey, just stick around. And then this high school girl kind of comes in and says, yeah, can we talk for a second? And the teacher and she go off into the shadows to discuss something. I'm
Right.
thinking like 10 years later, this would have been a Ridgemont High pregnancy situation or like teachers. But it
Well, I
also,
don't think you can depict that either right now. You could not depict that kind of thing happening right now. I know it still happens, but
right. But Kurt also, he keeps getting these little glimpses of here's what's going to happen or what could happen if you
right,
stay here. You are
right,
supposed to go to college.
right. No, that's a good pickup. Yeah, exactly. And you were talking earlier about this film being a showcase for a lot of young talent that went on to become legendary movie stars in a lot of cases, or in Ron Howard's case, legendary director. Um, I love films like that. I love Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Dazed and Confused because those films are the same. They get a group of the young, talented, cream of the crop actors, and then they go off and become big stars or Oscar winners or anything like that. Both films, Dazed and Confused and Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So they're almost like the American Graffitis of their era, you know.
Yeah. I mean, and those, graffiti was the 70s. You had Ridgemont in the 80s, and then, Dazed and Confused
Days
in
in
the
the
90s. So
90s.
it's like
And they're
everyone's got
all
their,
looking, they're all, well, Ridgemont's contemporary, but I was
yeah.
going to say they're all kind of looking back through their high school lens. The
And it's
car
interesting.
culture, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to say, Ridgemont is a contemporary set film, but it is
Yeah,
also, with Cameron Crowe, he was not that far removed from high school and he wrote that script, but he is also kind of looking back through at least the adult lens of someone who has escaped it and looking at it and trying to examine what high school is like as opposed to what it's been like portrayed on TV and the movies at that point.
yeah. And the origin of the book, though, is that he goes undercover
Yeah.
in high school again as a young-looking 23 or I have never read the book, but I get the idea that was the case, right? So that would be a nostalgic look back too, except from an observation standpoint.
One quick note on that book, because I
Okay.
talked about Ridgemont a few months ago with Don
Hmm.
Shanahan. I want to read that book so badly, but it is out of print. And the Amazon, like you can buy it on Amazon for like several $100s. I'm like, why is that book not available?
Right. Why wouldn't Cameron Crowe do like an audio book of that? That would be awesome.
The only thing I can think is it's got to be some weird rights issue, but
Maybe.
who owns that book? Just buy them out and reprint it.
Yeah.
But okay, so
I was just going to talk briefly about the car culture in the movie. There's a couple of things that really popped out, and I doing some research. But number one, it was it was the golden age. There was no guilt about cruising around the car. No global warming concerns, no $5 a gallon gas, no, and wasting time was a beautiful thing with everybody playing the same radio station. Everybody's windows rolled down, you can hear Wolfman Jack all up and down the strip. I mean, man, what a deal as far as a golden age of, and for him to be able to capture it while it still was good in his memory, sort of like when Dazed and Confused came out. You know, the high school days were still good in his Richard Linklater's memory, so he was able to convey it with such a presence, a now presence. So I really appreciate that. And also a note about the cars, which I thought was hilarious. So they had these cars at the end of the film, and they were all offered for sale in San Francisco newspaper ads. Only the 58 Impala, driven by Ron Howard, attracted a buyer, and they sold it for a few $100.
So the cars that were used in the movie,
that they were used in the movie, the production guy puts them in ads in San Francisco news, and nobody buys them. That tells you what a different era it was, you know, that those cars were considered used up, even though they were in a movie. Now, if you owned it, now, interestingly enough, the Citroen, the French car that Kurt drives, was owned by a teacher. He just lent to the production, which is a great Kurt car, by the way. And it was, by the way, it was a little anachronism. That was a 67 model. Mm. Anyway, so the teacher was able to sell it to somebody who was interested in the film, and now it goes around to various conventions, car conventions, as the original Citroen from American Graffiti. So interesting little car things about the movie.
Side note, but related, yes. Have you ever been to the Volo Auto Museum here in Illinois?
I have not, and I'm desperate to go.
My family and I went this summer, and yes. it's amazing. Yeah. I mean, it's not only is, you know, they have all sorts of classic cars, they also have a lot of cars and props from movies. It's like a movie geek lover's paradise.
Oh, that's great.
They also have a 4-floor antique / flea market thing. And I wanted to go, I wanted to spend the entire day there, but my kids unfortunately don't give a crap about cars or movies. So it was very much like going through, and I got to relive the experience of the museum by going home and looking at all the pictures of my phone that I took. I'm like, okay, moving on.
The only time I ever went to the Chicago Auto Show was on a press pass, and it was the night before the show. We had a huge blizzard. I think this was 2018, and so I just got on the L and traipsed through the foot high snow. There was nobody there, nobody. So I have the run of this place, which all the people, all the models, and all the salespeople, they're, hey, come on, sit in our car, sit in our car. So I get to the Batmobile, which Volo has, and Volo had the display. 66 Batmobile, and I said, is there any possibility that I can sit in that seat? And he goes, because there's nobody here, yes. He said, otherwise I never let anybody sit in it. So there I was, and I took a picture of me waving. In 1967, my mother took a picture of me in the Batmobile at a mall, so I was able to compare the two pictures 50 years apart from sitting in the Batmobile. Too much.
That's so sweet.
It was sweet. It was sweet. And, it was right before my brother died, too, so I was able to send it to him. And he was the geek, the comic book geek in the family. But it was just an amazing experience to sit in that actual seat again. Crazy. So I relate totally. And that's why ever since that time, I said, I got to get up to that Volo place. I have to see this place.
It is wonderful.
Yeah.
I've vowed to go again next year with the family.
We should get a geek squad to go. Let's get a group of geeks to go rather than you have to take the kids.
Well, I'm thinking I'm going to go with my family, but also, yeah, we'll get a field trip going of critics, and we'll make it a day. We'll report live from the Volo Auto Museum.
That would be fun. That would be fun.
But no, so back to American Graffiti
Yeah.
and the car culture. I'm always a sucker for whenever I see a classic car driving by this down the street, I have to like not only stop and gasp, but I have to like say, "Oh my God, look, it's a classic car!" And the kids
Yeah.
actually look and they're interested in that, but not when they actually have to go to a museum. Go figure.
Go
But
figure.
I just love that you get to spend some time inside these cars and you realize how
Yeah.
big these things were. They're like
Yeah.
sofas in the back seat.
Yeah. Yeah.
We haven't
And
talked
that's
about.
why the cruise culture existed, because you could pile in all your friends and drive up and down the streets. I mean, crazy. It's crazy.
And when Kurt gets essentially kidnapped by the gang, the
The
Pharaohs,
Pharaohs.
what was the name of the leader of the Pharaohs? I had it written down here, but it was
Hold
Bo
on. It's
Hopkins.
Joe is his name in the cast, but it's the great Bo Hopkins, of course.
The only thing I remember him from was the Wild Bunch. He was the
Oh,
kid. He was the kid in the opening who kind of got left
yeah.
behind in the opening heist, and I was like, "Oh my God, it's that guy!" And he's playing a completely different character here.
He
Uh,
did a lot of character roles in the 70s. I remember him from television and movies. I can't really think of his filmography now, but whenever I see him, he's one of those guys I immediately smile. And I'd forgotten he was in the film, and I was so happy.
I was happy too, especially because this is where I think George Lucas's talents, not only as a director, but as someone who I assume he had something to do with the casting of the movie, he knows how to find really great actors for these parts because the Joe character, he's a comedic character in some ways, but
Right.
there's this overcurrent of real menace.
Oh,
Kurt
yeah.
is sitting watching TV, and like you used to see a lot in movies, like they're the hardware store or the furniture store that has all the TV displays. They're playing TV and people like watch outside the window. Kurt is sitting on a car watching TV, and this gang rolls up on him, the Pharaohs, and they realize he realizes he's sitting. They're claiming that he's sitting on one of their gang members' cars,
Right.
and so they essentially say, "Yeah, let's go for a ride, all mafia style." And it's unclear what their original intentions were with him, but you kind of get the feeling that he kind of talks them into just like riding around with them, and through a series of fortunate events for Kurt, he ends up almost getting initiated into
Sure.
this gang.
I think all he has to do is the initiation rites, and he's in. But
Right, because he saves them from getting busted for breaking open some pinball machines, because he happens to know the guy who owns the place, and he talks
right.
the gang's way out of it. It's a sweet bit, but there's also this great level of criminality, and you never know when these guys are just going to turn on Kurt, because even though this has a reputation of being, oh, it's a PG movie, it's George Lucas, it's classic cars, it's all an innocent time, there's some real danger in this movie. And especially at the very end, which we'll get to, my
Mhm.
God.
Well, also, and it's an interesting point you make about the gang. The one thing it's like I was thinking, what's the motivation here? I mean, what are we trying to communicate here? Obviously, there were gangs in Lucas's, California days, but is it part of the transition? He's in making the transition. Here's the dark side you could go to as well. Um, and in that point too, the whole movie, 1962, they in one of the readings I read that Labor Day that year was the 3rd, September 3rd, Monday, September 3rd. They presume that this is the last day before school starts, right? So they're presuming that Saturday, September 1st, is the setting for American Graffiti. Saturday night, September 1st, because it makes perfect sense. So at that point, we're a month away from the Cuban Missile Crisis, which changed America profoundly, the safety issues, and of course, a year and a couple months away from the Kennedy assassination, which again was a transition point for America that lit another flame. So the whole atmosphere is in transition.
I hadn't really thought about this transition element until you began talking about it at the beginning of the show. And you're absolutely right. Whether conscious or unconscious, I mean, again, I don't know how you just set out to write this brilliant of a movie with all this stuff going on and make it look so bubblegum. I mean, one of the reasons I stayed away from American Graffiti is I would look at the poster. I'm like, oh, it's just cheesy. It's going to be like Happy Days, the movie. And I never really liked Happy Days.
Right.
But about the gangs, I think there's something in the name the Pharaohs, because you've got this idea of this, royal culture, and it's kind of like a sick joke because they quote unquote rule the town. And Dreyfus's character could have, if he had been inducted, he could have been one of the powerful gangs that has the run of the place.
Right.
But ultimately, kind of like the John character, he's going to realize at some point, yeah, I rule over a place that is going nowhere.
Yeah.
As opposed to breaking out and becoming a real prince of industry, if that's what he wants to do.
It's so funny you mentioned the poster. Another factoid I came across, because I'm an old Mad magazine guy. I mean, a lot of the movies that I learned about back in the day, Godfather and Exorcist, I first encountered them as satires in Mad magazine. But anyway, the cartoon movie poster was drawn by longtime Mad magazine artist Mort Drucker, who ended up also doing the artwork for American Confetti, the parody of the film, which appeared in Mad's April 1974 issue. So there you go.
Here, first of all, I'm a Mad kid from way back, and I found, or actually, I think I got it as a present recently. It was Mad About the Movies, the special version they put out in 1998. It was like the all Warner Brothers edition. I usually skip over intros to those kinds of collections, but this one had two introductions, one by Roger Ebert and one by Gene Siskel.
Oh, interesting.
And the Ebert one is one of the finest. It's only a page and a half long, but it's one of the finest pieces of writing about film criticism that I've read. And he talks about how Mad Magazine planted the seeds for him becoming a film critic, because he had always kind of passively watched these big movies, but reading the Mad satires, they taught him things about like cliches and conventions and tropes and kind of breaking that, fourth wall engagement between audience and film. And so he's talked about how instrumental it was in him becoming an analyst, and a legendary one. So yeah, brief.
We talked about Summer of 42 last month, or 2 months ago, or however the timeline is. And again, I did not see Summer of 42, but I did read the Mad satire of it, and it intrigued me. So a lot of these Mad parodies would, like the French Connection parody, the Exorcist, the Godfather, they're all like saying to me, go and see these movies, because we're saying this about them, so they got to be good in a way on another level, in actuality, rather than satire. So.
Well, that's something
that's an interesting thing about Ebert I didn't know about.
And I can't remember if it was Ebert or Siskel in their piece, but they brought up the idea that, and I don't know how true this was as a policy, but it seemed to be true. They never really made fun of quote unquote bad movies or B movies. They always went after like the prestige films that people kind of connected to and tore those down, because if you take like an example of like Tommy Wiseau's The Room, you can't satirize that because it's self-parody.
Right.
Yeah, but
there's a sense. Well, some of these big films now could use the sense of that deflation, but obviously, Mad can't exist because our world is a parody. So,
yeah, I miss Mad. Damn it,
I do too. I miss the whole feeling of Mad that I know will never come again, and I know that kids today don't have that connection to, not that it's good or bad, just is. So it's so funny that Summer of 42, I mixed up the bits with the store owners, because I thought in Summer of 42 he asked for Old Harper, but it was actually an American Graffiti where he goes in the liquor store and buys all the stuff.
Yeah. It might as well have been for both movies. I don't think that matters, but it would have been a nice connection.
Well, the rubber bit in Summer of 42 is kind of it's so different from Old Harper, but they're both getting illicit substances or things that are used for illicit purposes. Let's say drinking in one case and stooping in another. So there you go.
I have a question, because you've seen this movie a few times and I've only seen it the once. So to set this up, Toad, who's the nerdy character, he is asked to watch Steve's car for the night. and he takes her around cruising. He picks up Candy Clark's character, who's an older, more worldly woman, and she's like, yeah, well, let's go get some alcohol. So he goes to the liquor store, does the classic bit of like waiting outside, trying to find someone who's of age, give them money to go in and buy the booze.
Very well
First one
done.
doesn't work out. He doesn't, he strikes out, but then he finds a guy who actually gives him the money, goes into the store. Toad is waiting outside. All of a sudden, the dude bursts through the door, throws him a bottle of liquor. The owner comes out with a gun and just starts shooting into the night as the first guy runs away. What do you think happened there? Because he tossed him a bottle of booze, or a bagged bottle. So it's not like he lifted it from the shelf. I'm like, what happened in there in that 2 minutes?
I know. Isn't that funny? That's a great bit. And you know, I read in the research, I read that Candy Clark muffed her line when he came back with the stuff, but Lucas kept it because he liked the naturalness of people muffing their lines. Another example is when Mackenzie Phillips is hit with a water balloon. It was supposed to hit the window and splash over her, but it hit her directly, and she just started laughing. And Lucas was like, "This is great. We're keeping that. Print that." You know.
Well, that was the scene that led to, if I'm remembering correctly, when they were stopped in traffic, they got out and started like shaving, creaming the other car, and like water balloons and hoses. That was one of the most unrestrained, fun. Like, it felt like such an impromptu moment. It felt like this is something they did when they were waiting to set up another scene somewhere else. The cast was just having a great time, and Lucas happened to film it. It's so good.
Yeah, well, again, as a 13-year-old, when I first saw it, that scene is vivid in my memory because, my gosh, this is what people did this is what people do when they go out cruising or whatever. This is just the kind of unheralded, released fun that you could possibly have doing stuff like that. You know, it makes an impression on you when you're young because that's what you want to do, you know? And so it just, again, my dad, interestingly enough, I think had a sense of nostalgia, even though he was a bit older in '62. But that's the kind of culture he had. He had a car culture in the hometown that he grew up in, and the whole thing was driving around. So my grandfather was a stickler for his car. I mean, nobody could touch it or look at it. He was one of those types. So my dad tells a story a year before he graduated. His uncle comes to town. His uncle was sort of a foreign guy. He was like I guess Middle Eastern, but I'm not sure. There's another story about that. But anyway, so this guy had some bucks, and he just bought a new Cadillac. And my dad was looking at this car. Oh my God! And he goes, "Do you want to take it out for the night?" And my dad, and he said, I saw my dad's eyes just go like saucers because he couldn't believe that the guy was giving me a brand new car to drive around in. And he said it was the classic. He threw the keys. I caught him with one hand, and suddenly I was king of the block for one night. It's beautiful, baby.
Well, and that is really touching, but it also is indicative, I think, of what Lucas was capturing with this movie. Because
Exactly.
I'm watching this, and I'm sure you and other people who are fans of this movie as well. You're watching this, it's a great film. It's got a lot of misadventures, a lot of stuff happens, real coming of age stuff. But then you realize when you think about the phrase car culture, for these kids, this was happening every weekend.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
they went out every Saturday and got into trouble and narrow scrapes
Yeah.
and fell in love and all this other
And
stuff.
it was a natural thing that you were gonna get in a car and say hello to everybody, and everybody's gonna play the same radio station. You know, it's just it blows your mind, man. It just is mind blowing to think that that was a part of your normal development. Now we did some cruising back in my day, but it wasn't the same. You know, gas lines and the you know, that was the whole oil crisis time, and you just simply didn't waste, you know, gas by driving around. Think of all the global warming that occurred because, you know, every Friday and Saturday, the whole state of California went out in their cars and let that no carburetor drift go into the atmosphere.
Well, from global warming to heartwarming, I think it balances out. But no, I mean, I just think about like Steven Spielberg just remade, my God, why can't West Side Story? No
Yes,
idea why.
I
Uh,
don't know either why. Yeah, you're right.
you can't modernize or remake American Graffiti. I
No.
mean, you could modernize it, but it would just be an hour and 45 minutes of kids like being chaperoned by whoever was, suckered enough to drive. They'd all be in their cars, just like looking at their phones.
Yeah.
Someone
Yeah.
pulls up next to them and moons them. They're like, oh, guys, put it on my
Hey,
Instagram.
I got a bare moon here. I mean, yeah, yeah. Well, again, I hate old man criticism. Whereas it was much better in my day, because you have to live in the here and now. And those kids, the kids with the phones today, are living in the here and now. So their challenges are different. Their
Sure.
challenges are more global, I think, and global in the sense not just talking about the world, but talking about the world outside of their little niche in high school or wherever they're at. And they can't communicate to me what that is about, nor how can I communicate to them how my high school experience was without them laughing their ass off.
Yeah.
you know?
Here's the thing. I agree with you to a certain extent.
Uh,
I am having trouble imagining a George Lucas of today, 10 years from now, making a film about what a Saturday night like looks like in this era.
yeah, yeah. I
Like,
mean,
I don't know what
it
that I
would
don't know
be
what
the
that means.
empty streets and people just looking at their phones.
Okay, so like maybe
But
the era of like 4 years ago or two
but
years
there
ago
is a
before
lot
COVID.
of
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot. No, no, I'm not talking about the empty streets about the pandemic. But I think the Lucas of 10 years from now is going to look back at this pandemic era and maybe create an American Graffiti out of that, about the people stuck in their homes with their computers and what they're doing. Now, is that as interesting? I don't know. It may be in the right hands.
Yeah, I just imagine like if they make a drama or a comedy drama about last year and the Kurt character is like, I wonder if I decide, do I go off to college? Do I stay in my town? And they going off to college just involves logging into a Zoom class for Harvard.
Yeah, the morning of, he just click.
It's not him getting on a plane. It's just,
The magic carpet ride, by the way. That plane was called the magic carpet ride, which I
there you
loved.
go. Loves his
Um,
metaphors. Real quick, I want to, something you hinted at earlier, because I had made the remark about how I wish this had been more influential than Porky's. And you said that this was very influential.
yes,
Talk
let
to
me
me
talk
about the
about that.
influences. Yeah.
Okay, well, it has such a wild history because it was Coppola who approached Lucas and said, let's try and make a coming of age film. So he was producer, Lucas was the creator, and got people on board, et cetera, and started pitching it. And none of the majors really wanted it until Universal came along. And then once Coppola came on attached to it, the original budget was $500,000, a half million, which was a low budget even in those days. The pictures were going about a million up to 10 million in those days, but anything under a million was, freaking independent studio money. So anyway, the 500,000, Lucas gets attached. The total budget $750,000. It is one of the most profitable films in movie history. It eventually made $200 million after its re-release in the late 70s. Um,
Well, because I'd done some reading about myself, like there was such a lack of confidence in what this movie could be that it actually sat on the shelf for 6 months.
six
Now,
months.
I
Six
don't know
months.
if that means that the release was pushed back 6 months or if that meant that there was a period of a half year where they just didn't know what to do with it. But
I think
if
it's the latter. They just didn't know what to do with it. They didn't like the title, for one thing. They didn't know what it meant. I mean, again, when the suits get involved in a picture where Lucas had free hand to do because it was such a low budget and Final Cut, that was another thing. They wanted to recut it. There was a famous incident where Coppola said, "I'm going to buy this picture right now." Now the story is he brings out his checkbook and is about to write down, And because he didn't buy that picture, he lost $30 million because that would have been his cut had he signed on as a complete financier of it. Still to this day, he regrets it. But
Well,
another great thing is Haskell Wexler and Wolfman Jack got percentage points.
oh,
Wexler came in as a visual consultant because he didn't really designate a DP. And then Wolfman Jack was the inspiration for it. So he both gave him percentage points. Wolfman was able to retire on that money, and of course Wexler probably was able to free himself to do whatever he wanted, which he did during the 70s, but quite famously. So interesting. And Lucas himself made about $5 million on this. He became an instant millionaire. Put $300,000 aside to develop, you guessed it, Star Wars.
and it's crazy to think about, but he had so much trouble with Star Wars. I know that was like the whole,
Right.
like with Fox and everything, but he just had to fight tooth and nail for every,
Yeah.
it's great that he had this guardian angel and Coppola and that kind of
Right.
cadre of director,
Spielberg too.
creatives, right? But you just think about, like, when are you going to give this guy a break? He's a proven, he's a known quantity.
I would think after Graffiti, they would have said, do whatever you want. I mean, with the profits that came in from that. I mean, you're talking with promotion, it was $1.2 million, and then the initial run was $55 million. So that had to go, 80% of that had to go back to the studio because of the risk, not the risk, but the fact that they wouldn't give it
The
up to
stake,
Coppola.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
So
and
I mean, so its influence is basically it brought back. It started a nostalgia craze in America. It also its soundtrack was very influential, much like Easy Rider. It was a film that used the music of the old era to tell the story a bit. And the soundtrack album went into 3 printings. They had Graffiti, more American Graffiti, American Graffiti 3, where they used dialogue from the film and introduced the music into it, and pretty much started the whole rights issue where you pay astronomical sums to get money. Why wasn't Elvis in the film? Because RCA would not go along with the flat rate that they paid everybody else. So they had a request for 72 songs. It was cut down to 35.
Jeez.
I know. He wanted
Well,
to make the whole thing a soundtrack, which
well,
was
I
a genius thing.
I didn't realize there were 35 songs in this thing. Because I made a note, kind of a cute little remark to myself, that this has more needle drops than Train Spotting. But unlike a lot of modern films that just put pop songs everywhere, this stuff was really well. I mean, The Great Pretender you mentioned
Yeah.
is a classic example, because I believe that he would have been in that moment when that song was playing.
Right,
But
exactly. They were all in that moment as the song was playing, and the fact there were snippets too. The fact that they were using Wolfman Jack's actual pranks. They did play up one where Lucas played the caller, which I thought was hilarious.
oh,
It was the
wow.
pizza bit. Something they called the pizza place, and it was Lucas.
I gotta go back and watch that again.
Well, that's another thing. I've seen it easily over 5 times in my life, but I would say there's been a 20-year gap since I've seen it before. But it's so rich that I think you can watch this over and over again and still get some meaning out of it. Like if you watch it once a year for the past 30 years, you'd still get something out of it. And I think as you age, you get something more out of it. This is the first time I realized it was about transitions.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always looked at it on the surface with the story, but when you realize that every character is going through a transition, it gets even richer. And the people that they leave behind, like the teacher and the Moose Lodge guys and all that, they're the they're the dregs. They're dead inside already, and it's a warning to say you'll be dead inside too if you don't get out. So, and even Lamatte's character realizes that, in the sense of his drag racing days are pretty much finished.
Yeah. I do. Well, speaking of the drag racing, that brings us to the ending, the race.
Yes, yeah,
because
good,
Harrison
nice
Ford finally
transition.
catches. Yes,
Nice segue, sir.
I try.
The
Um,
king of segues.
but Harrison Ford finally catches up with Paul Lamont,
Yeah,
and he's got a special passenger in his car. Cindy Williams' character, is it Lori?
great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
she and Steve have this big blowout fight, and she goes kind of walking down the street and gets picked up, or she jumps into Harrison
yeah.
Ford's character's car. There's
Now
a
he has a different before he actually is with Deborah Lee Scott in the
yeah,
beginning of the film, who was a big sitcom star in the 70s. She was on Welcome Back, Kotter and things like that. But then when we see him again, he's with a different gal, and then he picks up Shirley Feeney.
yeah. So
Indiana Jones picks up Shirley Feeney. But go ahead.
well, it's weird seeing Harrison Ford in this, pre Han Solo, pre all that, but his accent seems to change. Like his first scene, he's got like a real drawn out like Chicago thing going on, and then he's kind of got a twang in it. I don't know what's happening, but he's
Yeah,
still
yeah.
cool.
That's so funny. You're absolutely right. And his character was supposed to have a flat top, but he refused to cut his hair, so that's why he's wearing a cowboy hat.
It totally works.
It does, because he is a cowboy. He's coming in as a gunslinger to take on the main sheriff in town. It's
But
beautiful.
it's weird because he looks so out of place, and yet it kind of makes it more perfect. You'd
Yeah,
expect like another, yeah, like a greaser or something come in, like I'm going to
right.
take out the other greaser, but this guy looks like he just moved from Oklahoma. He looks like he's 30 years old, and he's like, you know what I
He
want to do?
does.
I want to find the 23-year-old kid who's drag racing in this town and make a name for myself by beating him.
Well, also Ford's fame, subsequent fame, has reversed itself back into the character, because we see, we know of his subsequent fame. Now, when I saw it in '73, he was just another guy. He was the Oklahoman that you just mentioned, which is brilliant. That's so funny. It's exactly it. He looks
Well,
like a guy that just comes to the town. I want to race the fastest dude. And his car is kind of normal. It's not like a dragster or anything. It's just a tricked out 55 something.
yeah, and I love the way he describes Paul Lamat's car. I love old cars, but I don't know them. So
Right.
I think he mentioned it was like a 37 or something. Like it's an old car, but he's
Yeah, the
kept it up
body
really
is a
well.
37 dragster, I guess, or a 37 whatever, yeah.
But it's this yellow color, and Ford is constantly giving him crap. Like, I don't know, I can't decide if that's piss yellow or puke yellow. What do you think?
That's when he's in the car with the different girl, not Deborah Lee Scott from the beginning. It's
Right.
some anonymous blonde who I couldn't figure out who it was. But let's get to the. I want to mention the Suzanne Summers character
Oh
when we
yeah.
talk about but let's talk about the drag race, because that is really something.
So there's a race at dawn.
Yeah.
Kind of classic stories. Kids show up. Toad is the guy who's in the middle, like, saying go, and then he runs for it. The race doesn't last very long because almost
No.
immediately Harrison Ford's car with Lori in it skids on something and runs into a ditch and flips over several times and catches on fire. Now, this is, it kind of in keeping where this is the beginning, I think, of the downward dark trajectory that this film takes in the last few minutes, which was
Right.
honestly shocking. But the
I
car
thought it was
flips over.
shocking too.
Right. But I'm like, are they dead? Like, did George Lucas just kill off our beloved, high school
Shirley
cheerleader?
Feeney and Indiana Jones? Did he just kill him off?
Right. And fortunately, they escape, but then just narrowly because the car just explodes. And I'm sorry to say that, talking about Harrison Ford's subsequent fame, like when he's being hauled out of the wreckage and like, I don't know if they put a blanket around him or something, but I just kept thinking of that he's had a couple of notable plane crashes in the last couple of years. I'm like, I don't know.
Again, the subsequent fame reverses itself back into this role.
Yeah, it's a
But
big loop.
it's so funny you mentioned that, because when I saw that, I'm like, no seatbelts. There's no way that you walk out of that without at least a broken neck or something, because of the violent way the car went around. But Shirley just gets out and she's fine and reconciles with Opie right on the field there. And I read in the research notes that they had actually been wrapped in the film. They'd already filmed the scenes that they were, the airport scene and everything. And they were actually just watching the drag race, and they said, we got an idea. And so they had the wardrobe people get their clothes back, and that's what they did that scene in the field.
Wow.
And it connected to the plane because that's when he decides he's not going back east and becomes an insurance salesman.
Well,
So, what else do you want to say about the drag race?
I mean, that's pretty much it. I just do want to, because we haven't really talked about Ron Howard beyond the fact that he was Opie. Um, I was so glad that this became an ensemble movie because I realized, and I haven't seen Ron Howard in a lot, but I realized he has a much better talent behind the camera than in front of it. It might have just been the restrictions of this character, but he just seemed like kind of a nasty, really horny Richie Cunningham. And it just, I didn't, he was kind of stiff. I'm like, he felt like he was in real life transitioning from a
Right,
child actor and more of that
right.
innocent, like Andy Griffith Show mode into something that was more mature. And like he was having trouble handling it.
Well, I think he wanted to make that character intentionally harsh to get away from the Opie thing. Um, there's a famous story about that movie where there's some annex at a Holiday Inn where Harrison Ford and Paula Matt and everybody would get like super drunk. Okay, so in one incident, Dreyfus gashes his head on the bottom of the pool, and then he has close-ups the next day, and he has this big gash. So, but with Ron Howard, it was horrible. They'd throw bottles of him. Dance, Opie, dance.
Oh my God.
I know. I mean, he he must have just felt. He really spent the '70s getting away from Opie because he played Richie Cunningham, and he also started doing Eat My Dust and all those things for Roger Corman. So in his development as a director, so you have to give that dude credit for breaking away from Opie. And now he embraces Opie, of course, because most people call him that still.
Well, and that's the thing is I have nothing but respect for Ron Howard,
Yeah,
as a director, but also as an actor. I'm just saying that as an audience member, I was kind of
interesting.
uncomfortable watching it. I think partially because this may have been the character that seemed so much like other characters in other movies like this that I've seen.
Right,
There
right.
was so much richness of the other folks and their storylines going on around, and they're like, oh, we're back to this couple again. I mean, I was more interested in Cindy Williams, giving him, giving as good as she got in terms of like,
Yeah.
he's constantly trying to put the
She's
moves on her, and she's
again,
like,
that's
I'm not
another.
having it.
She's a very interesting character in this movie. She's 17 years old. She's about to go into her senior year. She's obviously one of the most popular gals in the school, dating the class president. I mean, but she has a dark side to her. I think she's like maybe bipolar or something, because as soon as he mentions, rightly, I think for 18-year-olds that I think we should see other people while I'm away at college and everything, she just kind of takes a nosedive. And that nosedive sort of perpetuates itself through the entire movie until she does the turn in the car and walks out with near a scratch.
Well, I mean, yeah,
If I say near.
I like that. Well, now I'm thinking Nair like the hair remover, but no, but
That too.
but no, I mean, like I understand where her character is coming from. The see other people thing is one thing, but then he's trying to like pressure her. I think he even says when he's trying to seduce her in the car, like, "Can you give me something? Don't you want something to remember me by?" I'm like, "What do you mean, a baby?"
Yeah, I know. Well, there is that undercurrent, but it's not really emphasized. And when you said earlier that you think he's going for it in his last night, I'm not really sure, and I'm not sure how far they've gone as a couple. I think there were different standards back in those days, obviously,
Hmm.
and it may be the pet thing or whatever. I don't know, but the implication is that they haven't slept together, and there was no real implication that we're going to score tonight as I go off to college. It was more like I got to get out of this thing because it's going nowhere and I'm going away.
Hmm.
So again, transition.
Yeah.
Transition.
Let's transition.
Transition.
Let's transition to talking about Suzanne Summers.
Yes, I do. I originally, as I read in some of the notes, that she was supposed to be a ghost image, meaning that she was just his fantasy, but we were going to find that out later, or find that out in the beginning of the film, where she was going to emerge from an empty drive-in, which still exists, by the way.
Mm.
And she was going to emerge from that, and that she was going to then go on to the earthly plane and seduce Kurt's character. But
That's a totally different movie.
another interesting footnote. Obviously, her part was cut back and cut back and cut back, but she's driving this vintage T-Bird. I mean, it's the cherry sweet, and the owner was hovering over the set, making sure that she did. She said, the one memory I have from that film is this guy constantly haranguing me because I was driving his car.
Yeah, I'm sure that was the reason he was constantly hanging around
Well,
Suzanne Summers.
yeah, 20, not one 25-year-old Suzanne Summers.
Oh,
oy.
But the very end of the film, the gang is on the tarmac. They see Kurt off onto the magic carpet plane. And then you see him kind of like looking wistfully out the window.
Yeah.
And then it cuts to these bizarre ass title cards.
Did you read a little about the background of those? Very strange.
No, but I saw that, John, Paula Matt's dragster character was killed by a drunk driver like 2 years after this, or 3. Yep. Toad was killed in Vietnam.
Yep.
Steve became
in action, MIA.
Right. Steve was an insurance agent, and then Kurt was a writer living in Canada, which is weird because, again, thinking back about Stand By Me, at the end of the movie, it's a little bit more upbeat. We find out that River Phoenix's character died in a stabbing incident. But in the novel, Stephen King made it a point to show that all the boys except for Gordon died horrible deaths. And it's really jarring after this kind of sweet coming of age story. Like, yeah, nothing worked out for these characters. And that kind of carries over into American Graffiti, especially with Richard Dreyfuss becoming a writer as he did in Stand By Me.
And he's in Canada, meaning that he dodged a draft.
I hadn't picked up on that. Yeah. Wow. Because this is a Vietnam era movie. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're 18 in 62. So 4 years later, when they get out of college, and that's when you could have been drafted again, it's 66, and that was prime time for getting on the plane and getting your ass in the jungle. So I don't know when the Canada thing started, but I assume that's that's why he's in Canada.
Yeah.
But the one thing about those title cards, very controversial, by the way, and the studio wanted that out because they didn't want to do that. Well, notice they do nothing with the women. You don't see what happens to them, And years later, not years later, but as a contemporary, Pauline Kael, who I think is overrated, but it's just about the way criticism is now. But anyway, she thought that was a very chauvinistic thing, that they would show the dudes, but not show the women and what happened to them. Now, they had to adjust the title card later for Paul LeMatt's character because they made more American Graffiti, and they had to adjust the timeline of his death so they could show more of his story.
See, I saw that they had made a sequel to this.
It's called one of the worst sequels ever made. I've only seen bits and pieces. But the cast comes back, except for Dreyfuss.
Because is he still off at college or whatever?
He's probably in Canada. I don't know. I've not seen the movie, so I don't know if they mentioned him or not. So
I'm just wondering,
I'm curious about it now.
I'm wondering how long apart in the movie universe's timeline are they? Is it like 2 years later or the next year? Or
well, in Paul LeMatt's character's case, why can't I think of his name? John.
Yeah.
He's dead within 2 years, so I think they start the movie with his story. This is another thing about it. It was supposed to be an ABCD movie, meaning that one story would start, then the next story would start, and the next story would start. Well, the first cut came out to be 3.5 hours. Could you imagine the 3.5 hour American Graffiti? What the hell was in that picture? I
would watch the hell out of that movie.
I mean, seriously, that he cut an hour and a half out of this thing? What?
Well, I guess the extra 2 hours would have been all the Elvis cuts that they realized they had to dump.
But it would be interesting to see what ended up on the cutting room floor or ended up in that first cut. But anyway, I don't know my point. Just that, this movie is considered an American classic, up there, in the lofty register with the Library of Congress sort of thing. And what is your opinion about that? Is this the Citizen Kane of teenage frolic movies?
I've certainly not seen every teenage frolic movie, but
But you know what I'm referring to.
right. But I stand by my original assertion, which is that, I think Porky's was more influential only in the fact that, in the 80s, you saw this glut of teen sex comedies, which, I'm a fan of a lot of those movies.
So
But I feel like this is a movie that dealt with adult themes without indulging in, the teen horniness beyond, kind of trying to cop a feel here and there. Right. But if I just kind of wish that there had been more substance to a lot of those films and had that become the dominant narrative rather than, how many
Right.
girls can we get to take off their blouse?
Not
But
that I'm protesting that.
well,
but
sure,
yes.
right. But no, but the other thing is George Lucas spent the next 3+ decades making Star Wars and kind of producing other stuff. But
Yeah.
I know he made Red Tails after, I think, like right before he sold to Disney. And I liked Red Tails. I know I'm like
It's
the one
okay.
person on the planet who did, but
No,
that,
I liked it.
well, what I've seen of George Lucas outside of Star Wars, I've loved, and it just kind of makes me wonder what would his career have been like
Right.
if he hadn't gotten sidetracked with Star Wars. Like he made A New Hope, it didn't go anywhere, so then he had to make other personal movies because there's some really thrilling, cool stuff in American Graffiti that reminded me of things I saw in Star Wars, like with the racing and the kind of the pursuit aspects and the menace mixed with the lighter adventure stuff. That I think he is a hell of a filmmaker. I just think if we had seen 15 movies out of him in 30 or 40 years rather than 6.
Right. And just the Star Wars stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
How about Indiana Jones singing Some Enchanted Evening to Shirley Feeney? Wrap your head around that one, America. They actually have the credit, Rodgers and Hammerstein in the, oh, by the way, credits, interesting. Because he couldn't, because of the pay scale on the movie, it was a low budget picture. He offered a credit at the end of the movie to people, and they jumped at it, and they worked for free. I'm sure they got compensated later because of the movie making so much money. But can you imagine? You've never seen a credit for second photographer or whatever, or B camera roll, and suddenly he says, "I'm putting you in the end," because he wanted one last song.
Oh.
And it was the Beach Boys All Summer Long, which is one of the best songs they ever wrote. And it was funny when I was watching it with the subtitles. I'm like, I've never even focused on the lyrics. They suck, but this song is great. This song is All Summer Long is just, it's 2 minutes of heaven, and the harmonies in that. Oh my God!
I'll have to go back and listen to those lyrics now.
I know, it's just so strange. It's like, we're hanging our underwear out to dry, something like that. It was just so weird.
Well, maybe it's a song about pool sex. I can get behind that.
Oh, there you go. We're back to Porky's.
Yeah, but no, but
we
yeah,
should have been drinking some Old Harper while we did this. It was in the afternoon. I think I would have.
Hey, I'm drunk enough on this conversation.
Oh, it was really good, really good. I am so happy to revisit this film because, again, it's such a touchstone in my life, and I dedicate this to the old man because he brought me in.
Well, I can't dedicate this to my dad because I don't know what the hell he would have thought of this movie if he ever watched it. But I'm certainly glad to have watched it and discussed with you. I made the mistake of renting it on Amazon as well. I should have just bought the Blu-ray because that's going to happen really soon.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks again, Pat.
Yep.
I've really enjoyed this one, and we're gonna be back next month with what I dare say is going to be a vastly different conversation. But we'll save that for next month.
All right.
All right. Take care, sir. Blessings. All right. Bye.